Hello again, everyone. Welcome back. We're still in Chapter 5 of Chaos by Tom O'Neill. And I think we're just going to get started. The next section is called The Biggest Circus. Around the time I reached an impasse with Gunther, I began to research another figure from the county sheriff's office, one whose scintillating claims about LASO and Manson had circulated for decades among counterculture enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists. Preston Guillory, once an LASO detective, had left the police force under a cloud of suspicion. In December 1969, immediately after the LAPD had announced Manson's apprehension. A couple of years later, in 1971, Guillory gave an interview to Mae Brussel, a cult favorite radio host whose show trafficked in conspiracies, some plausible, others outright loony. Reading through the transcript, I found myself more intrigued by Guillory than I wanted to be, especially in light of what I'd gone through with Gunther and Whitley. Guillory's thesis was this: Manson had gotten away with far too much at the Spahn Ranch in the months before the murders. Even though he was a federal parolee, Manson had no job. He had ready access to drugs, alcohol, and underage girls. He had a cache of firearms, and LASO officers knew all about it. At LASO's Malibu station, Spahn was in its jurisdiction. Manson's lawlessness was something of an open secret. Which, again, why? If this guy's just some loser who's always, pretty much been in jail off and on most of his life, why does he have this special status? Why is he afforded it to be an open secret? It doesn't make sense. Why is he so special? Firemen patrolling the ranch's fire trails had even encountered Manson and the family toting machine guns, and yet Manson never paid a price. The cops always looked the other way. According to Guillory, that was because his station had a policy handed down from on high: make no arrest, take no police action toward Manson or his followers. And so, despite the raft of crimes that Manson and the family were committing, they were never apprehended, and Manson never had his parole revoked. There was even an occasion where Manson was picked up by LASO police for statutory RAPE, some words you can't use on YouTube, guys, but they ended up cutting him loose. Even as the station instituted this hands-off policy, they kept a close watch over Manson. Guillory was sure that LASO's intelligence unit, or some other intelligence unit, one of those three-letter ones that we heard a little bit about, was running surveillance on the Spahn Ranch. He alluded to memos about Manson with cover sheets to protect against prying eyes. That went straight to the station captain, and who knows where after that. Guillory didn't think the surveillance was just a local thing. Maybe it was higher up at the federal level, perhaps the CIA. I don't know. Then came the murder of Gary Hinman, and soon after it, the Tate LaBianca murders. How had LASO failed to see this coming? They'd been monitoring Manson constantly. Guillory theorized that the massive August 16th raid on the Spahn Ranch was LASO's effort to cover its tracks after the murders, calling it the biggest circus I've ever been involved in. He marveled at the fact that all the charges had been dropped 72 hours later. Something didn't add up about the raid. All that force, all those arrests, for nothing. It was like we're doing something perhaps a week late to show that we'd really been watching, he said on the radio. Oh, so that's to build a cover story for them if it all blows up in their faces, maybe. But that raised a bunch of problems. If the sheriff's office was surveilling Manson before the raid, it would have known enough to bring him in for the murders. If it wasn't watching him, then how would it amassed enough evidence to get the search warrant authorizing the raid? It is a circus then, huh? When the LAPD held a self-congratulatory press conference to announce that Manson and his group were suspects in the Tate LaBianca murders, Guillory decided to become a whistleblower. He went to a news station, KCAL, and told them everything he knew, thinking the press would be all over this story. They hardly touched it. So the press was in on it too. Y'all ever heard of Project Mockingbird? That's another CIA project, and I believe it's probably still going on. Almost certainly. It's where, all the press and basically entertainment, things on TV. There's an agenda there, let's just say. Look into it if you never have before, Project Mockingbird. We're all pretty much brainwashed. That's the gist of it. Worse, the leak cost him his job. LASO's Internal Affairs Department got wind of his remarks and sent him packing. After his departure, LASO did all it could to discredit him. An internal memo said that no one should discuss his previous employment there. It implied that he was a drug addict and an unrepentant leftist bent on smearing the office's reputation. Listening to Guillory's radio interview, I couldn't say if he was a crackpot or not. Probably or not. I think it was, I'm going to butcher this quote. I think it was Tucker Carlson said that being a conspiracy theorist doesn't mean you're crazy. It means you're knowledgeable, basically. Like, you follow the breadcrumbs where they lead. He was airing a version of events that a year before I would have dismissed as sheer lunacy. And he was doing it on a radio show that traded in unadulterated paranoia. But his message resonated with me, especially now that I knew how much had been covered up. Gunther had convinced me that the tape of Beausoleil's phone call was real, and I never would have believed that either. It seemed possible, if not entirely plausible, that there was still more to the story of the sheriff's office, especially its bungled raid on the Spawn Ranch. I added Guillory's name to my whiteboard, one more in the jumble of cops and Hollywood has-beens, witnesses reliable and unreliable, with fading memories and ulterior motives. Then I picked up the phone. He wasn't hard to find. He ran a private detective agency, paired somewhat oddly with a traffic school. That is kind of odd. But I guess if he's a kind of disgrace, he's probably doing whatever he can to make ends meet, I guess. Out of a strip mall off the highway in Riverside. When I drove out to visit him, I was relieved to find him calm, confident, even fearless. He had a strong recollection of what he told Mae Brussel back in '71, and he stood by all of it. That's the thing. If you're lying, it's really hard to keep track of your lies. If you're telling the truth, then you probably have a much easier time recalling things because you don't have to remember what lies you told people. I learned that from Judge Judy. Okay, as we spoke, I noticed he had a weapon in a pouch on his desk, along with some model police cars. His diploma and graduation photo from the Sheriff's Academy were hanging on the wall behind him. See, it's another collateral damage of Charles Manson. This dude's career, he obviously cared about it, was, just gone to the dustbin, all because he wanted to tell the truth about this creature. Despite his contentious end with LASO, he remained a proud cop. We were told not to bother these people, he told me, referring to the family. The order came in a memo from his captain. Tell him whatever we saw or heard. That was one of the first things that I was told when I got to Malibu. Peter Pritchett, the sheriff of LA County at the time, was memo-minded, Guillory explained. He exerted immense authority, and that authority extended to his officers' conduct with Manson. We were asked to generate memos every time we had contact with any member of the family, Guillory said. So if there's that kind of paper trail, it makes you wonder what happened to it. Was it all destroyed? Is it in some box somewhere in a warehouse? Is it sealed somewhere? I don't know. Despite this intense period of information gathering, Manson was never charged when he was arrested. Why was a law-breaking parolee allowed to go free? A lot of times we arrest people and the DA would say, we can't keep this person in custody. He's too valuable. We want him on the streets. Now, why would they be more valuable on the streets? Gathering information, maybe? My suspicion is that Manson was left alone for a while for some reason. I don't know. It was very unusual that someone with a record like his would be left on the streets. Very strange. The shock of the Tate LaBianca murders, Guillory thought, forced the sheriff's office to hide its own intelligence gathering efforts. If Manson were guilty of homicide, how could anybody possibly say that we left him on the streets? There would have been civil liability issues, careers would have been destroyed, and of course, it would have cost Pritchett the next election. There's a lot of crooked stuff that goes on just so people can remain in office, and it's like the more you hear about it, it kind of makes you angry, right? But that didn't explain why the police allowed Manson to go free for another 3 months after the Tate murders, knowing he could have killed more people. Why not just arrest him right away and keep their surveillance program quiet? Guillory had no idea. He'd been asking himself the same question. All he knew was that Manson was under some kind of loose surveillance by our department or somebody else. We know he's been watched by somebody, but we don't know who. The thing is this, if he was under surveillance, those people left the ranch on 2 occasions, committed the 7 homicides. Why was there no intervention? He added that there was no legal obligation for LASO to intervene. They could have chosen to let the murders pass without action if Manson were so important that they didn't want to risk interrupting their surveillance. That's kind of shocking, isn't it? I mean, I guess if you're working on something bigger and something happens with who you're surveilling, might you let that go to get the bigger fish? Or I don't know, but it's horrifying. Guillory was fairly confident that someone from LASO knew right away that the family had committed those murders. Probably someone saw them come and go, and there's a log entry someplace. And then, of course, later they found where they went, and all hell would have broken loose. Plus, he reiterated, LASO never could have launched such an extraordinary raid without sound intelligence, enough to persuade a judge to grant a search warrant. You don't mount a raid without surveillance like this, he said, especially the biggest raid in the history of the state at that time. More infuriating still, none of it stuck. The sheriff's office went to all the effort for nothing. And it didn't have to be that way, Guillory was sure. We did find evidence of enough criminal activity, stolen property, narcotics, to violate Manson's parole in the first place. Well, yeah, he shouldn't have had even one gun, so that, you think, at least would have kept him in jail. I don't know about the others. It was astounding. I never could figure out why he was released. Guillory had been part of the operation that day, and he remembered finding stolen purses, wallets, and pocketbooks with IDs, all damning evidence, and all seemingly ignored. After the raid, he said, the surveillance ended as mysteriously as it had started. That is just very weird, isn't it? In another interview with the writer Paul Krasner, Guillory explained, it appeared to me that the raid was more or less staged as an afterthought. There was some kind of grand plan that we were participating in, but I never had the feeling the raid was necessary. He speculated that Manson was never arrested because our department thought he was going to attack the Black Panthers. Yeah, like I said, the more you talk about it, the more you hear yourself talking about it, the sillier it sounds. Their intelligence had revealed that Manson had shot Bernard Crowe, whom he mistakenly believed to be a Black Panther, in July, and this apparently convinced LASO that Manson was going to launch an attack on the whole organization. Of Guillory's many outrageous claims, this one was maybe the hardest to swallow. But again, he stuck by it when I asked him. I believe there was something bigger Manson was working on, he said. Cause a stir, blame it on the Panthers. I've got to believe he was involved based on all info we have. Maybe a witting player in someone else's game. But who was that someone? How high were they in the hierarchy of society? When Manson was finally brought to justice for the murders, LASO took dramatic precautions to hide its surveillance of the ranch. I thought what they were doing was illegal, Guillory told me. All the crime reports disappeared from the station. Everything was gone. Well, there's my answer about where those memos went. All of our reports were gone. Normally, you had access to your own reports, but they were all gone, disappeared. The whole file was gone, and the memo went up that no one involved in the Spawn Ranch raid was to talk to anyone outside the department. That convinced Guillory to go to a reporter, the move that cost him his job. So he was a whistleblower, basically. I found Guillory credible, if overheated. I knew I wanted to believe him, and that put me at risk of falling into the great trap of conspiracy theorists who come to believe in grand plots simply because they make the world a more fascinating place. Certainly, I'd have a more interesting magazine story on my hands if Guillory were correct. But that was a big if. And it sounds like it'd be hard to prove with all that evidence being destroyed, right? I was in touch with a number of former LASO deputies at this point, and I collected their opinions on Guillory. One described him as kind of an off-the-wall guy. Another said he had a giant chip on his shoulder and hard feelings for the sheriff's department, always feeling that he was being beset upon. According to the most pejorative story I heard, Guillory had once tried to kill himself in the most dramatic way possible. He had barricaded himself in a motel room in Malibu, I believe, and one of the inspectors was trying to talk him out of the room. He was threatening to take himself out, and he had an automatic weapon. I asked the officer if he'd witnessed this firsthand. I wasn't actually there, he said. I just heard about it in the station. So if somebody's trying to cover something up, might they create a story like that just to make someone seem less than credible? Could be. John Graham was the inspector who talked him out of the room. Guillory called this allegation bullshit, reminding me that LASO had embarked on a campaign to discredit him after he left. They tried to put me out of business, basically. It was goodbye, we'll see you, never darken our door again. I was crazy, malcontent, a loose cannon. If he'd really barricaded himself in a motel room, he said, produce a report. Neither LASO files nor the media would have any record of it because it never happened. Ask Captain Graham, where was the hotel? What was the date? Tell him to put up or shut up. In so many words, I did. I called Graham, who, like his colleagues, had a negative opinion of Guillory. But had the man really barricaded himself in a motel room? Not that I know of, Graham said. So Graham was supposedly the one who talked him out of the room and from offing himself. And he's saying he doesn't know anything about it. That's an interesting development, right? Once I told him the story, he changed his mind. Now that I recall, I did hear that there was probably a phony attempt at self-deletion. But he hadn't been there. So if he hadn't, then who was, if it actually happened? However reliable Guillory was, and I came to feel he was largely reliable in the end, I was in a familiar predicament. I needed documentary evidence to back up his claims. My best shot was leering at me from the pages of Helter Skelter, the search warrant for LASO's massive raid. If Bugliosi had found it, couldn't I? All right, the next section's called On the Paper Trail, again. Charlie Gunther was wary of appearing in my story, but we still talked a lot. When I told him I wanted LASO's files on the Hinman case, he made a phone call. Next thing I knew, I had backdoor access to the office's closed case archives. With some directions and the name of another retired deputy sheriff scrawled on a piece of paper, I parked at the Sheriff's Training Academy in East LA and knocked on the door of a windowless, barracks-like building. Sounds like a creepy place that you probably wouldn't want to go. The deputy let me in and walked me through rows of dusty filing cabinets, stopping in front of two and leaving me alone with them. See, I think Tom O'Neill got some really, I don't want to say special treatment, but he was allowed to see some things that probably no one else was allowed to see. And why that happened, who knows? Probably people who had a weight of guilt on them or wanted someone to out the truth and just had no way of doing it otherwise. That's my guess anyways. I pulled up a folding chair and opened the top drawer. It was crammed with disorganized documents that appeared not to have been handled for decades. In the silence of the large dim shed, broken only by the occasional sound of gunshots from a nearby firing range, I began my search. The crux of the reports, to my delight, covered sheriff's activities at the Spawn Ranch over the roughly 16 months the Manson family had lived there. So they really were keeping an eye on him 16 months. Over the next few months, I made half a dozen visits to the hangar at the Sheriff's Academy. The retired detective was always happy to see me. I suspected I was the only other person he saw all day. Yeah, that sounds like a pretty boring job, guarding a barracks full of dusty old documents. When I had questions about language or codes in the reports, or even LASO procedure, he'd patiently explain to me as I took notes. See, I mean, what are the chances that you'd get access to all this info and then have someone there who could explain things to you? Like, if you're not a cop, you might not understand the lingo or how things work, but this is a retired detective. Well, that's pretty fortuitous for Tom O'Neill. And he let me photocopy documents, but only after reviewing them first. After a while, he barely glanced at what I brought him, instead reminding me how he preferred his coffee. I'd always return with a cup when I ventured out to a Kinko's nearby. I wasn't entirely surprised when I learned several years later that these visits of mine were completely unsanctioned and unknown to LASO top brass. In one of my earliest visits, with great relief, I found a copy of the search warrant for the August 16th raid. Although other researchers have since uncovered it, at that time it had never been seen by anyone outside law enforcement. Once I read it, I could understand why. It revealed that LASO had a far broader understanding of Manson's criminal activities and his guru-like control over his followers than had ever been shared with the public. Running to 16 pages, the warrant was rooted in the testimony of Deputy Sheriff William C. Gleason, who sought permission for LASO to recover stolen automobile parts and rifles, automatic pistols, and revolvers from the Spawn Ranch. Charles Manson was the only suspect identified by name in the document, which stated that he was the unchallenged leader of the crime ring and also on federal parole for grand theft auto. So he's on parole for grand theft auto. I mean, yeah, he's not supposed to have guns, but he also has stolen automobiles. I mean, how is that not landing him right back in jail? That last bit is crucial. It means that LASO was officially aware of Manson's parole status. If the police turned up any stolen vehicles or weapons, and they did, of course, he would be in violation of the terms of his release agreement and would have to go back to federal prison. If Manson was aware of that fact, he didn't act like it, and the police had already shown a willingness to look the other way. The search warrant related an incident from an Officer Williams of the LAPD. He told Deputy Gleason that within the last 2 weeks, he and his partner were on duty at the Spawn Ranch. Mr. Manson was bragging to the officers about the weapons available to him and his friends at the ranch. So he's bragging to officers. I mean, that's pretty bold if you know that you're on parole and an ex-convict. You should not have those things. Mr. Manson told the officers that while he was talking to the officers, that his friends had rifles trained on the officers. How does he get away with that? I don't understand. This is standard procedure whenever officers approach the ranch, he told them. Manson had flouted the law and bragged about it to LAPD officers as he had his followers training rifles on them. Something else, incidentally, not reported in Helter Skelter. Manson's cavalier, taunting behavior continued. Yeah, I mean, that's ballsy, is it not? I mean, he had to know he was protected, because why would you act like that? Why would you ever act like that? It does not make sense. Elsewhere in the warrant, the LAPD's Ted Lee said that he had found 3 loaded ammunition clips for a carbine that fell from a dune buggy while on the highway sometime on or around July 29th. Lee soon heard from Manson himself, who said the ammunition was his and that he would stop by and pick it up. So this ex-convict on parole says he's going to stop by the police headquarters and pick up his ammo that he lost. Ballsy, that's all I can say. So Manson, a paroled ex-con with a known history of violence, had simply called up the cops and asked them if he could come collect the ammunition he'd lost. And he'd done this a little more than a week before the Tate LaBianca murders. Manson, the warrant noted, had been mentioned in prior memos, which fit with Guillory's insistence that police knew how dangerous he was. But they obviously did not care. Whether that awareness was the result of surveillance was an open question. The warrant explained that LASO deputies had cultivated an informant at the ranch, someone who has seen guns in practically every building on the property. The informant was also threatened by Charles Manson, and there was extensive reconnaissance by the same Officer Lee, who flew over the Spawn movie ranch approximately August 1st, 1969, and observed a 1969 Volkswagen lying in a ditch. How often did the LAPD use planes to investigate car theft? I would imagine not too often. Why were they flying over the ranch, which was out of their jurisdiction? I mean, obviously this was before drones, but still, it doesn't seem likely. I mean, I could be wrong. I'm not a cop for sure. Manson was prepared to match their vigilance. Per the warrant, someone in the family had bragged, "We have a guard at each road inn with a rifle and a telephone, so if anyone comes in, we'll know they're coming." Another memo quoted Manson telling a fire inspector, "Don't try to play the man, because the next time you try it, you'll find yourself hanging from a tree, upside down, dead." And 2 days before the murders, an informant told an LAPD sergeant that Manson was on his way back from San Francisco with a young runaway girl and a large amount of narcotics. The memo was partly correct. Manson had been in Northern California with a young runaway, but he'd been in Big Sur, not San Francisco. Who knows if Manson had that large amount of narcotics or if they played a role in the bloodshed to come. In any case, the document shook me. It suggested that authorities had tracked Manson with plenty of diligence and with the help of an informant in the days before the murders. They had a reliable sense of his comings and goings from the ranch mere hours before he dispatched his killers to the Tate house. And yet, somehow it took them months to pin the murders on him. Given the abundance of evidence, it came as no surprise that the raid had been authorized. Manson was practically begging for the strong arm of justice to come swooping in. When it did, the police got more than they bargained for. I found a one-page arrest report for Manson dated August 16th, the day of the raid. In addition to the stolen cars and weapons, the arresting officer wrote that Manson had 4 stolen credit cards in his possession that day. They fell out of his shirt pocket as he was being taken into custody. This had never been reported before, so there's more criminal evidence of criminal activity from this parolee. In summary, Manson, the known federal parolee, walked away from an arrest that caught him with stolen cars and credit cards, an arsenal of weapons, and underage runaways. And meanwhile, 2 of the LASO's best homicide detectives failed to realize that the biggest raid in California history was going down at the very same ranch that their murder suspect had called. The plot thickens then, right? Is it negligence? Is it lack of communication between departments? Or is it by design? I don't know. Let's keep going. The next section is called Hundreds of Man-Hours and Zero Indictments. Bugliosi, you may recall, had chalked up the failure to a simple mistake. The search warrant was misdated, but now I had it in my hands. I saw no evidence of any misdating. The warrant was clearly dated August 13th, 1969. According to the California Penal Code, a warrant is good for 10 days after its date. The raid was completely legal on August 16th, a fact I verified with many police and attorneys. So they let them all go, and in Helter Skelter, it said they were released because of a misstated warrant. That is the only reason given, and that has been debunked right there. So I don't know, what can you say about that? I mean, you would think, it just doesn't make sense why they would organize this gigantic raid, let everyone go. Are they trying to cover for themselves? I truly don't know what the rationale is. Was there another potential explanation? Ed Sanders went a bit further in the family. In addition to the misstated warrant, he wrote that the family was let go because of insufficient evidence. To figure it out, I talked to Bill Gleason, the sergeant who'd written the search warrant, and spent 2 weeks organizing the raid. So I spent 2 weeks organizing this thing. We spoke often. I always found him quick to smile and patient with my questions, even when I implied that he'd been negligent. Gleason was still furious at Bugliosi and Sanders for impugning his reputation with their talk of misdating. Yeah, it did make the cops look bad. I'm surprised they wouldn't have been like, wait a second, no. But if everyone's hiding something, I guess not. They led millions of readers to assume that a clerical slip-up had invalidated the hundreds of man-hours that went into the raid. The insufficient evidence excuse, Gleason told me, was closer to the mark. The problem was that none of the evidence, stolen vehicles, guns, could be linked to any of the suspects, most especially Manson himself. It was all scattered around the ranch. What seemed in the warrant like an airtight case turned into more of a fishing expedition. It's pretty hard when you got 27 adults there to prove who actually stole a car. I guess that makes sense. Gleason told me. They tried to dust one of the vehicles for fingerprints, but it had been sitting out in the dirt for so long that they got nothing. The warrant specified Manson's body to be searched for car keys and small parts because he was said to be the leader. Gleason said, "But do you sleep with your car keys?" I asked. "I know I don't." Thinking it was ridiculous to expect to find them on Manson's person at the crack of dawn. "No," Gleason said, laughing. "At 6 a.m., we didn't know what they were going to be doing." "What about the stolen credit cards? They were found on Manson's person, having fallen out of his shirt pocket. Couldn't they have prosecuted Manson for those?" "Yeah, we could," Gleason said, "but we didn't know he was going to have credit cards when we were doing the search warrant. It was the DA's call, and if he says we're not going to prosecute him, there's not a whole lot I can do." See, it's these little technicalities that get people out of stuff, it seems like. Robert Shern, the DA who'd signed the warrant for the raid and then dismissed the charges a few days later, was still working at the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, so I set up an interview with him. Surrounded by plaques and awards, Shern greeted me with a warm hello and told me to take a seat opposite his desk. Like Gleason, he said that it was hard to bring charges in a case where the thefts couldn't be linked to anyone. "But what about the credit cards?" "It's been so many years," Shern replied. "I don't know if I was told about the credit cards. If they're in a report, I assume I would have been shown the report, and I would have been able to determine that there were, in fact, some stolen credit cards attributable to him." Maybe Manson was never caught attempting to use the cards. He couldn't recall. I mean, at that time was 30 years later, so you can't blame him, I guess. "So you just don't remember what went into that decision?" I asked. "I really don't." He looked a little sheepish, and the silence lasted a beat too long. "All I did was just fill out the card and went on to my next case." My inner skeptic had trouble taking Gleason and Shern at face value. But let's say they were right, that the colossal raid of Spahn Ranch had failed to yield any arrests worthy of prosecution, and that it was only a freak coincidence that it brought them so close to the group responsible for so many murders. Even if you believe that, LASO isn't free and clear, because a week after their botched raid, the sheriff's deputies arrested Manson again on totally different charges, and again, he was allowed to go free. On August 24th, the owner of a property adjacent to the Spahn Ranch alerted LASO sheriffs that someone was trespassing. Deputies drove out to find Manson and a 17-year-old girl, Stephanie Schramm, in an abandoned cabin where they'd just had sex. On a bedside table were several joints, and the LASO brought in Manson once more, this time on a felony pot possession charge and for contributing to the delinquency of a minor. As with the raid, published accounts of this incident are thin at best. Bugliosi kept it out of helter-skelter altogether, and Ed Sanders makes only passing mention of it in The Family, writing that Manson and Schramm were released because there was no pot in the cigarettes, only tobacco. However, according to an arrest report I found in the LASO files, the joints did contain pot, and on August 26th, the sheriffs released Manson anyway, instead charging Schramm with felony possession, even though she was a minor with no criminal record. What? So this guy not only gets released, but they pin this on a 17-year-old girl? That's pretty crazy. No reason was given for the decision. The day after Manson's release, on August 26th, a judge signed another warrant, this time for Manson's arrest on the strength of his having been found with drugs and a juvenile. This time, LASO detectives never even bothered going to arrest him, something else none of the 40-plus LASO officers I interviewed could explain to me. And again, something left out of helter-skelter. Manson stayed at the Spahn Ranch until he moved to Death Valley around September 10th. Y'all ever been to Death Valley? I have been once, and I vowed never to return. It was so awful. Not because of the vibe of Charles Manson. It's actually a neat place, but I got so car sick, and I get car sick anyways driving to the airport, but it was so bad. It was just like this, I can't even describe it, but I have vowed to never return. There's this ghost town my husband wants to go visit there that this guy's revamping. You should check out his channel. It's called Ghost Town Living, I believe. I'll put a link in the show notes. It's a cute show. This guy basically bought an old ghost town, and he's trying to revamp it and stuff, but I made a vow never to go back to Death Valley, so I don't think we're gonna go. My husband can go with my son. Not me, I'm not going. I'm not going back. All right, sorry, I got off on a tangent there, guys. The DA's order rejecting the pot charges against Manson was signed by Monty Fligston, the deputy district attorney of Van Nuys. Incredibly enough, like Schern, Fligston was still working in the DA's office. When I called him, though, I found him much warier than Schern had been. I gave him a quick rundown of the files I'd found. Manson, Schramm, marijuana, delinquency of a minor. Ring any bells? I have no recollection, he said. Do you recall investigating Manson at the time of August of 1969? I didn't participate in any of the Manson issues at all, he said. I offered to fax him the documents so he could verify his signature. He said he didn't want to be involved and hung up. So he's lying, and then when he gets caught, he just hangs up. Oh, fair enough, fair enough. The LASO deputies who'd arrested Manson were flabbergasted when he wasn't charged at any point after the raid, especially given the effort of the raid itself. It was a bunch of bullshit. The deputies and the DAs had numerous chances to get Manson behind bars or to keep him there, and they failed, which at this point seems to be on purpose, right? Is it just me? Even if none of Manson's charges were prosecutable, they were egregious enough to send the parolee back to prison. Bugliosi said as much in Helter Skelter. During the first 6 months of 1969 alone, Manson had been charged, among other things, with grand theft auto, narcotics possession, RAPE, contributing to the delinquency of a minor, and who knows what else. There was more than ample reason for a parole revocation. Remember way back there was a judge that's like, this dude is not a good candidate. Well, I think it was for probation, but probation, parole, whatever. And he's proving that over and over. If LASO officers did try to get Manson's parole officer to send him back to prison, I found no written record of such a request in the files. No one I spoke to could even agree on whose job it was to report a federal parole violation. The DA said it was the detective's job. The detective said it was the DA's job. And at the end of the day, everyone said, wasn't it the parole officer's job? So everyone's passing the buck. It's always been a problem, Bill Gleason told me. The guys would get arrested and released before the PO could place a hold. Then again, I had it on good authority that it was precisely Bill Gleason's duty to have told the parole officer, and he didn't. I felt like I was trapped in the swirling eddies of some forgotten bureaucracy. Maybe Manson was just the beneficiary of a simpler time when police had fewer forces at their disposal and cruder methods of communication. You might think that in the beginning, but it's just so, it's over and over and over. And it just seems like the cops cannot be this negligent or bad at their jobs. It doesn't make sense. Samuel Barrett, who was Manson's parole officer at the time of the murders, told me he'd never been informed of the August 1969 arrests. If a parolee was involved in a crime at the local level, he said it was paramount for the DA to file the charges. Otherwise, it would be hard to send anyone back to federal prison. But sheriffs, the DA, I said, they all said it was up to you. They passed the buck, Barrett said. It's all hearsay without filing charges. That is the end of the second piece of chapter 5. Are you guys enjoying this? I know some of you are, some of you are not. I am going to go back to Helter Skelter and find the account of the raid because, like I said, it is just so underplayed in that book. And once again, that book is touted as the official narrative. And it's just weird. It just doesn't add up. It's like, why? This raid was a Herculean task, apparently. It took weeks to plan, tons of logistical, things to arrange. And not only did they all get released with no charges, the reason given, supposedly that there was a problem with the warrant, but Tom O'Neill laid eyes on the actual warrant, and that was a lie. So I don't know how you document things as a detective or whoever was in charge of that raid, but how did they document that they were all released and the reasoning for it when a quick look at the warrant would tell you, no, that's not true. I mean, who's signing off on, oh, good job, you guys, you messed up with the warrant. I guess we have to let them all go. I would think someone would have to sign off on that. And if they took a look at the warrant, they would quickly realize that no, that wasn't the case. So it's a mystery. It's a mystery. And, you know, it's been so many years, we'll probably never know, but, you know, you get these, Tom O'Neill, I mean, you got to hand it to him. He got some interviews with key players. He got to go look at records and stuff that, you know, Joe Schmo is not going to get to go look at. He got to make copies of them, got led into places that he shouldn't have. I mean, I know you or I are not just going to go walk into some evidence locker and not only be shown whatever we wanted to look at, but been able to leave, go to Kinko's, make some copies, and then if we had questions, ask the guy that was there. I mean, it was pretty good fortune for him. So anyways, I hope this is getting more interesting to you. Obviously, there's someone higher up pulling the strings, saying let this guy go, saying he's protected for some reason, some mystery reason. And yeah, it's gonna get better. It's getting better. One more piece to chapter 5, guys, and then we'll be on to chapter 6. Yeah, I hope you guys are doing well. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one. Okay, bye.